Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. Today I am delighted to be joined by Ziyad Al-Aly, a doctor and researcher studying long COVID. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. Delighted to be with you.
It's really exciting to have you here. So to begin with, would you mind giving a bit of an introduction to yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm a physician. I specialize in nephrology. That's the study of kidney diseases. That means I take care of patients normally with kidney disease, with hypertension and diabetes, who then go on to develop kidney disease. And I'm also a clinical epidemiologist. I'm a researcher who specializes in the use of big data to solve questions or to address or answer questions that are really important to the public. Prior to COVID, our work was primarily focused on studying medications for diabetes and also the effect of air pollution on diabetes and kidney disease and other things. And then after the pandemic, we sort of felt that we needed to do our part to address the issues related to COVID. So we established a pipeline of research on COVID-19.
Awesome. So, and I think you were one of the first to start ringing the alarm bell about long COVID. Can you tell us how you started researching long COVID and what drew you to it specifically?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So really at the beginning of the pandemic, when sort of COVID started hitting the United States, or SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19 started hitting the United States, we assembled, as a team around a virtual table at that time because we were all working remotely. And then we sort of started discussing how can we do our part to really respond to this pandemic? How can we do, our part to really meet the challenge of COVID and to, just pitch in and do our part. And it was very clear that, some of us who are clinicians and doctors, we need to go to the front line and volunteer there and help in the intensive care unit and on the wards. But some of us also in the group are purely researchers, they're not clinicians. And so we've resolved to identify questions that are important to the public and address them. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't really know there was something called long COVID. We knew that COVID is hitting, and I remember the first question that we asked and addressed in our research is really trying to compare COVID versus flu. Because at that time, everybody was talking, is it really worse than the flu? Is it the same as the flu? Is it milder than the flu? I was we're scientists. We know how to do this. We need to answer this once and for all. And obviously, COVID is much, much, much worse than the flu. And then we started getting, sort of reports from patients, actually, and actually I remember vividly reading the first op-ed piece by Fiona Lowenstein in the New York Times, saying, let's talk about coronavirus recovery and how does coronavirus recovery look like? And really, weeks after the initial infection, she and a lot of other people were reporting, lingering cough and shortness of breath and fatigue and some brain fog and all the other symptoms. And that sort of started this sort of really teaching us, to the patients, all the patients, and this is really kudos to the patient advocacy groups and the, vocal patient movements, started teaching us and telling us that, hey, everybody was telling us this is a respiratory virus, it affects the lungs. You get sick for 2, 3, 4 days or a week or two, and then you get better. But look at me, I'm 6 weeks out, 10 weeks out, 2 months out, 3 months out. I'm not back to normal. I'm still weak. I'm still tired. I have a brain fog, fatigued, and all these sort of symptoms that they started reporting to us. And so we sort of decided right there and then that we need to investigate it. And that time it wasn't really clear that there was really even, a name for it. It wasn't really clear that this is sort of a big thing. That's back in April and May of 2020. And, like just really literally a few months after the initial COVID case in the US. And then we took it from there. We decided right there and then that this is something that deserves examination and assessment. It deserves us putting the effort in trying to understand it. And all these patients are telling us this, and we need to understand it. We just need to really figure out what long COVID is, or at that time it wasn't really called long COVID until later. And that sort of started our interest in this and led to the first paper that we did on long COVID in Nature, and then sort of subsequent projects to try to characterize and understand long COVID.
Yeah, of course, because it's quite hard to remember back to that time now, sort of getting on for 2 years on from there, remembering that actually it wasn't called long COVID at the time. We didn't know what it was. I think certainly for me, and I think quite a lot of other people, we didn't realise that there were lots of other people who weren't recovering. We thought it was just us, and it was big and scary, and then I guess over a little bit of time we did all realise that there were lots of other people in the same position. Not that it really helped, but at least it made us feel a bit less alone, So, how much of a problem is it? There are people calling it a major health crisis, but do we have any idea what the number of people with long COVID could be, like worldwide?
So because governments are not counting long COVID, and so we sort of feel there are no official estimates about long COVID, but the short of it is we estimate there are likely millions and millions of people with long COVID in the US and many, many more around the world, like certainly in the UK, in Europe, and elsewhere and around the globe. It is a big problem. And I think the worry that we have is that most people are focusing, especially policymakers are really focusing on acute COVID. They look at COVID and they want to look at the number of cases of COVID, and they want to look at the number of hospitalization and death in the 30 days after COVID. And they want to count that, and I sort of think that's really the metric. And that's what we think is really the tip of the iceberg. So if you have like this big iceberg, you only want to look at the tip. You look at the acute COVID and hospitalization and death from acute COVID. That is literally the tip of the iceberg. Long COVID is what's beneath that tip. And we think it's actually much, much, much larger. And really, I think the challenge there in sort of, coming out with estimates is that there are a lot of studies out there, and estimates really vary. So there isn't really one official estimate. Governments are not counting it. But our assessment is, from the studies that we've done, and also looking at the literature and looking at what other people are finding in terms of estimates, that the problem is really a big problem. And that there are millions of people with long COVID in the US with various problems. Now, all of them have fatigue or brain fog. Some people have, heart attacks or blood clots and different manifestations. So, and we think it's a serious health problem that deserves attention now, to start helping those patients now and addressing it and treating it now before it becomes even a much, much larger problem down the road. So we certainly think it needs a lot more attention that it's actually, getting. So we and you guys, sort of scientists and patients and patient advocacy groups, we need to keep promoting visibility of this issue of long COVID, because again, I think it's certainly a big problem, and most policymakers now, most legislatures, most public health officials are really focusing on the acute effect, which we think is really narrowly focused or myopic focus on only what's here and now and not what's going to come after. It's almost like when you have a tsunami or an earthquake, you're focusing on the 2-3 minutes when the earthquake hits, but what about after that? That's really where most of the problems happen. And the same thing with COVID. We're focusing on the acute effect. We're forgetting, that the aftermath or aftershocks, so to speak, are going to be really have broad ramifications and will last for us for generations.
Yeah, for sure. Big issue. My experiences can testify to that, and there are so many others. Do we know, are certain people more prone to getting long COVID? I think anecdotally it seems to affect more women than men, but could there be certain age groups or groups of people that are more likely?
So what we know about long COVID now is that it's not one thing. We've now started calling it a multifaceted disease. And some people, it might present like fatigue with brain fog, and some other people will have like, oh, I have hair loss and I have, some skin problems. And another person might present as blood clots and having all these like clotting problems. And some of them actually may have blood clots that travel to the lung and impair oxygenation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a multifaceted disease. It has many faces, and in different people manifest differently. This is what makes it challenging to generalize, to say, well, like long COVID is more common in women, or long COVID is only, if you have poor health to start with. What we've learned so far is that long COVID can spare nobody. There are kids with long COVID. There are 90-year-olds with long COVID. So you have like, kids to 90 years old and everybody in between. You have 20-year-old people with long COVID, 30-year-old people with long COVID, 40-year-old people with long COVID. You have males with long COVID. You have females with long COVID. And it doesn't matter. You have athletes who have long COVID. You have people who are like, 70 or 80 years old and are very, very sick. And then on top of that, they have long COVID. So it doesn't matter if you're an athlete or an old person with many comorbidities, or if you're a male or a female. So really, that's what makes it complicated to generalize. It's like really more common in women. What is more common? Are we talking about fatigue? Are we talking about hair problems? So long COVID isn't really one thing. It's really a multifaceted disease, and it's not monolithic. So it's not sort of all behave in the same way in different demographic groups and different population groups. But I think, again, what's really evident, what's really, 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 really clear is that it can affect anybody. And maybe males may manifest differently. We sort of see different manifestations in different people. And that's what makes it a little bit more complicated to really digest. And this is what we feel like more research and more sort of understanding of the condition is really needed, sooner than later. Like we feel it was needed like a year ago. We sort of feel like we need more people devoted to it, so we can actually start solving problems and really coming up with treatment and helping people. And that's really, in our view, so far has been slow.
Yeah, I mean, you said that there are lots of different manifestations of it. So, I don't know, for example, heart problems or breathing problems. Do we know anything about whether those sort of symptom groups are more likely to be attributed to certain groups of people, or is it a bit difficult to do that as well?
No, you're certainly right on point here. So when you sort of long COVID is this basket of a lot of things, right? Like long COVID, it's a multifaceted disease that can affect nearly every organ system. When you started like saying, okay, like what about sort of a neurocognitive decline, or what people refer to as brain fog, right? So where does this happen most? And it actually happens most in the elderly. And that doesn't mean that you cannot have children, even a 10-year-old or 15-year-old children who have brain fog. It doesn't mean you don't find young adults, people in their 20s and 30s have neurocognitive decline. But it's really most common or most manifest in older adults. Like you've said, also like heart disease tends to be also manifest more in older adults. We've seen that, things like skin problems and hair problems and all, those actually tend to manifest in younger adults. And so different manifestations, or they call them in the world of long COVID, sequela or different sequela, may manifest in various population groups. But when you generalize like long COVID, when people talk about long COVID, well, long COVID is not one thing, isn't really one thing. If you ask, you go on to a cafe or a restaurant and you ask 10 people what long COVID is, you come up with 10 different answers. Now, obviously, things like fatigue and brain fog, those are almost like a, sort of universally like signature or cardinal manifestations of long COVID. But it's not only that. I mean, we new onset diabetes. We see even kids, 9-year-old, 10-year-old kids who never had any health problems at all, gotten COVID. Now, all of a sudden, like weeks after COVID, 2, 3, 4 weeks after COVID, they now have new onset diabetes. These are kids who had no problems at all before COVID, gotten COVID, and now have diabetes as a result of COVID. We see people with heart disease, lung problems, brain problems, stroke. It's almost like, initially I was shocked. I mean, initially when I first sort of tried to understand like what sort of the range of organ manifestations or range of organ involvement in long COVID, I thought like, this cannot be true. It cannot be happening. There's nothing on earth that can sort of wreak havoc in so many organ systems. But that is the truth. That's what we're dealing with. That is the truth. That is COVID. that is long COVID. And that's what makes it really hard to generalize, to say like long COVID is more common in young people or older adults. I think the main message we want to leave people with is that long COVID can happen in anybody, even in children. It can happen in athletes, can also happen in people who are not athletic, can happen in women, and can also happen in men. It can happen in people who identify as Black, people who identify as white. It can happen across racial groups and ethnic groups and gender or sex, and across age groups for sure.
Yeah, definitely. We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Definitely. You talked about the different organ systems that it can affect, which is basically all of them. And there's been studies that have said that the virus is still present in different parts of the body. So like in the brain and the heart, for example, many months after COVID. What does this actually mean?
So these studies are like really absolutely fascinating. So, NIH has recently released a preprint that hasn't yet been peer reviewed, but it's an autopsy study of 44 people where they sort of like dissected the brain and different organs, including kidneys and liver and the lungs, and tried to see, weeks after and months after the initial infection, can we recover the virus from these organs? Did the virus, invade these organs? Has it really persisted, for months after the initial infection? And the answer is yes. There's clearly evidence now of a virus, of the SARS-CoV-2 in brain tissue and lung tissue and other organ tissues months after the initial infection. So what that tells us a couple of things. Tells us, one, what's really obvious here, that this is not a lung virus only. Certainly, this is not a pulmonary virus or a lung virus only, that it clearly, evidently, clearly goes to other organs. And number two, can help us understand like sort of the range of extrapulmonary manifestations that we see in long COVID and why. It can sort of help us to unlock the why, that this is really not a, yes, you maybe started when you had SARS-CoV-2 infection or COVID, you may have started with cough and shortness of breath and feeling, this is a lung infection or upper respiratory infection, because you may have started there. But that's not the whole story, that the virus can then from the lung or from sort of like the nose or the airways or respiratory tract can then sort of seep into the circulation and then go to other organs, including the brain, which might explain brain fog, including other organ systems, which might explain why people have kidney disease or heart problems or, new onset diabetes, and can sort of help us unlock all of that. And I think that's really, that's sort of on one end, it's really, sad and unfortunate that SARS-CoV-2 isn't really a mild virus. It would have been more wonderful for all of us if this was a mild virus that sort of gives you a cold for a couple of days and, and people can get better. But the reality of SARS-CoV-2, that it's really not a mild virus. It's not only a respiratory virus. So I think we need to start sort of shifting our thinking from thinking about it as a respiratory virus or respiratory infection to more like a systemic virus and systemic infection, because that's really the truth. That's really what's happening. This is not only a respiratory virus in a lot of people. Reframing it as a systemic infection, that can sort of also help us understand what's happening in long COVID.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess it generally starts in the lungs because you breathe it in, but it obviously then spreads around after that.
Yes, certainly. I mean, so we're not confusing people on the podcast that the mode of entry, it's airborne. COVID is airborne. So definitely you need to wear your mask and definitely it goes through you. So people don't confuse that. But that's really the first step, so to speak. I mean, and yes, it results initially in respiratory infection, but that's not the end of it. And I think we need to sort of start thinking about it and framing it as a more of a systemic virus.
Yeah, sure. That's a horrible kind of thought that it's everywhere in your body, isn't it?
It is. And I don't know if there is this is the right word, but it's horrible. I mean, that this is, certainly not a virus that confines itself to the respiratory tract, that it goes elsewhere, that some people can have it in their brain and some people can have it in their, pancreas, or some people can have it in their liver or their kidneys. And it could be, wreaking havoc in those organ systems. And that's what may explain sort of the manifestations that we see in those organ systems.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've got people talking about symptoms fluctuating over time. I mean, I certainly know this from my own experience. You have breathing difficulties one day and then the next day you feel a lot better. And then 2 days later, you start getting all sorts of other symptoms, whether your toes turn blue or something else. Do you know, is there a pattern to this, or is it different person to person? And is that anything to do with the virus being in different parts of your body?
So this is what we don't know, but what we know for sure that it's really variable, and we know for sure that this is really, it fluctuates. So people sort of wake up one day and they feel fine. Oh my God, I gained my energy. I'm not fatigued today. And wake up the next day profoundly fatigued. Meaning that they sort of like they could start the day fatigued and then switch. I mean, later on feel better, or vice versa. So it really fluctuates, and there's no sort of consistent pattern that we can weave across all the patient reports. But what is absolutely clear is certainly is variable. It varies from one person to another, and within the same person things vary between one day and the other, between 1 week and the other. So it seems to be variable, cyclic, or episodic, and we don't understand if that's sort of related to things maybe the immune system is doing, or things that sort of related to the virus itself. And I think this is where we really need more research here to try to better understand it and be able to sort of, once we understand it, we can maybe like manage it in a way, or treat it in a way to make sure that people are feeling better all the time, or most of the time, than sort of this episodic fluctuation. But it's very, very clear that it's not consistent all the time.
Yeah, and I think certainly for me, that's been one of the frustrations of it. You never know when you're going to get a good day, and when you do, dare you do anything on it, because you risk having a bad day. But it can also be, I was going to say random, it's probably not random, but it appears to be random sometimes.
Yeah, it may not be random, but to us, like, because we still don't understand it, we can't predict it. Like, you can't really know what you're gonna have, what's tomorrow. Like, we can't. Like, I can't tell me and you. We can't say like what's gonna be tomorrow. So for us, it's really unpredictable, and that's really the thing that's really annoying the most. It's like really unpredictable. The only thing that's predictable is that things will change. You think you're good now, maybe tomorrow will be different, but it's hard to tell what's tomorrow, or the day after, or maybe the weekend, what's going to happen on Saturday. I don't know. And that unpredictability is enormously annoying.
Yeah, and I guess that's also making it very difficult for people who are trying to work.
Oh, yeah.
Because they'll be able to work 2 days and then they'll be off for 3 weeks. And I think employers probably would find that quite difficult. So you mentioned earlier, you're talking about children getting long COVID. I mean, we heard from the start that children and young people ought to be fine. They shouldn't really be affected. People say, oh, kids don't get COVID. And we obviously know this now to be completely untrue. But is the way it manifests in children, is that different to adults? What's it saying on that?
So unfortunately, there is less research on children than adults. So there's not as much, like in adults, even in adults, I sort of feel the research is not as good. I mean, it needs to be even better and needs to be more, but in children there's less. But what we know for sure is that you're absolutely right, that COVID can happen in children. So that's true. So what we know is that long COVID can happen in children, absolutely true. So, children manifest a little bit differently, but not very differently. I mean, we still see the fatigue, we still see sort of like their sense of smell and, like for weeks on end, and they haven't really fully recovered. We still see fatigue. We still see brain fog. We still and we still see diabetes. Actually, the reports that I talked to you about, like people who are 9-year-old and 10-year-old coming down with new onset diabetes. These are kids who never had problems. They're not obese, never had problems with diabetes or sugar control, don't have anybody in the family who had diabetes, sort of like say, no, it's not a genetic thing. So like they don't have relatives or anybody in the family who had diabetes. All of a sudden, They get COVID, 2-3 weeks later, they get diabetes. So it seems overall that the signature sequela, or what we're sort of seeing as, manifestations of COVID-19 and long COVID in kids is not very, very different than adults, not very different. Obviously, we still don't know the long-term trajectory. I mean, kids may, so grow out of it and feel better. And so there's still a lot we don't know. And I think I have to caveat this with the broader statement that there's less research on kids than adults, for sure.
Yeah, of course. Can we talk about the different variants? So I think this has been a big thing, new variant, or what does this mean? And do we know if any of the different variants will produce different levels of long COVID? Are they more likely to produce it, or less, or equally, or do we not know?
So what we know is that, at least with the Delta variant and all the prior variants, they all produce long COVID. So it's very, very clear that they produce long COVID. What's really the big unknown so far is really the Omicron. Omicron is really new, relatively new in the US and in Europe, and actually even in South Africa where it originated, it's actually still relatively new, right? So and long COVID is really a chronic disease. Long COVID is not really what happens in the first 30 days. Long COVID is not what happens in the first week of the infection, and really what happens afterwards, what happens in months 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, right? So I think it's still a bit early to tell the numbers of long COVID from Omicron, and whether long COVID after Omicron is really different than, say, long COVID after Delta. And I think this really would be the subject of studies by our group and others to try to understand it. But I think it's really too early to tell. What I want to say, though, is that I don't think we really should minimize, Omicron, because I sort of hear a lot that's like, oh, well, Omicron is really mild. I think the way we should think about it, it may be milder, but it's highly transmissible. And if it really ends up infecting a whole lot more people than, like, actually as it did, because we now know the number of people infected with Omicron, and how the number of cases skyrocketed in the US and elsewhere when Omicron hit, it may end up actually resulting in far, far, far larger number of long COVID people than Delta did. So I don't think we should sort of really minimize the effect of Omicron. I think we should continue to take it seriously, and we should definitely, continue to protect ourselves and our kids and our neighbors and everybody else. I mean, that's really absolutely very important. Not taking Omicron seriously and allowing people to be infected is really an invitation for incapacitating people for a long period of time. An invitation to get more people sick with long COVID and more people disabled for a long time. And it's absolutely not the right policy measure, but not by the US government or any other government.
Yeah, because this idea of Omicron being milder, I mean, maybe it is, but a huge number of people with long COVID had an initial, what would have been called mild illness. And there are even people who had asymptomatic illness and ended up with long COVID, aren't there? So the idea of it being mild is not the whole story, I think.
This is absolutely on point. So what we've learned about long COVID is that long COVID can happen even in people who had really mild disease, or some people asymptomatic. People say, oh, I got COVID, and I had like maybe mild, maybe a fever or like slight fever for a day, and I felt fine. And then 4 or 5 weeks later, they cannot get out of bed. They're like literally incapacitated, fatigued, weak, and cannot get out of bed. They have problems with blood clots or stroke. And some of these people were nearly asymptomatic or asymptomatic during the acute phase. And they'll tell you, oh, I didn't even notice I had it. I didn't even know I had it because I felt fine. I didn't have any problems. And then weeks later, they have a problem with long COVID. So I don't think we can sort of take the idea that the virus is initially mild to really mean that this is not going to really produce long-term consequences. We now know that this is not true. This is not true.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we still should be being careful.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is why the idea that sort of abolish public health measures and drop masking, that's really absolutely insane. This is absolutely insane. This is sort of an invitation for more people to be infected and more people to be disabled, and in our view, the wrong policy measure to take.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And there's been a lot of talk about vaccines and long COVID symptoms, and some people have said that vaccines have helped them, and that's awesome. It didn't help me, but people who are vaccinated and still catch COVID, which is, I think, becoming more common by the day, are they still equally at risk of long COVID despite being vaccinated?
So I think this is still a subject of intense discussion. There are like several papers out there, including a preprint by our group that is actually still being peer reviewed. So, but let me start with an Israeli study first. So there's like a really nice but small study from Israel that said that people really are vaccinated and then get COVID afterwards, which we now call breakthrough infection. Their risk of long COVID is similar to the control group, meaning that they don't have a high risk of long COVID. And we don't really think that's really what's happening. So in our data, which is much, much larger now, about like 33,000 people with breakthrough infections, the risk of long COVID compared to the people who really got COVID without vaccination is slightly lower, but not really dramatically lower, meaning that if you're vaccinated and then get breakthrough infection afterwards, you're still at risk of long COVID, and maybe a bit lower than people who are not vaccinated at all, but it really does not totally eliminate the risk. And I think, again, what this tells us is that vaccine is really one layer of protection, that if you're vaccinated, you can still get a breakthrough infection. And even if you're vaccinated, you still need to wear a mask, you still need to protect yourself, you still need to avoid very highly crowded place, unless absolutely necessary. You still need to protect yourself because vaccination is really only one layer of protection. And if you're really relying on one layer, we know that it's wonderful. Vaccines are miraculous and absolutely wonderful, but they're not 100% effective. And you can get breakthrough infection. And people who get breakthrough infection could absolutely certainly subsequently develop long COVID.
So the vaccine will lower your risk of catching it in the first place.
Correct.
But it won't stop you from getting long COVID if you do catch it.
Yes, that's exactly the right conclusion. So vaccines are one layer of protection that really reduces the risk dramatically of getting COVID in the first place. But if you manage to get it, breakthrough infection, people are coming back to the clinic with fatigue and brain fog and weakness and all sorts of things. I mean, this is happening in people. So with breakthrough infection, those people are vaccinated and got breakthrough infection. So if you manage to get a breakthrough infection after vaccines, there is still a risk of long COVID for sure.
Do we know if people can get long COVID twice? Say they got COVID at the beginning of the pandemic and they managed to recover and then they caught COVID again. Do we know anything about the chances of that?
No, I mean, I like, so because COVID fluctuates a lot in people, so like it's hard to know, like if they get another infection with COVID, it may reactivate, fatigue and weakness. And it's not like really that's long COVID twice. That's really the same thing that got reactivated because what really complicated about long COVID is not really, there's no flat line there. It really, see somebody today and they're really feeling fine and they get a call tomorrow and it's like, oh, totally not fine. So it fluctuates by day, it fluctuates by the hour. And, a lot of things can trigger things, people exercise a little bit or do house chores or go to the grocery store and then they come back and they're absolutely wiped out, totally wiped out, they have to go to bed and that's it. They cannot do anything else. They have to go to bed. I don't call that like a second long COVID. It may be reactivation of the same things. But I agree, we definitely need to understand, like people who get repeated infections with COVID, who get like maybe COVID once or twice and 3 times, those people fare differently than people who really only got it one time.
I guess there aren't that many people that have recovered either, so it's hard to tell.
Well, that's really the thing too. I mean, it's really hard to tell, who had complete recovery from long COVID. So that's really what's remarkably hard to tell.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much. Do you have any thoughts on what can or what should be done to help people with long COVID?
I'm approaching from the angle of research. I think we definitely need to keep pressures on governments and research groups to do more research on long COVID. And I think people need to try to orient the research agenda in a way that hopefully, move in a direction where we can get it to treatment. because I think that's really what's absolutely very, very important.
Yeah, because of course it won't be one treatment for everybody, probably. It's going to be all sorts of different things.
It is.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? It's like we've got to understand it more in order to know what to research in terms of treatment, I guess. And then we've got to research the treatments themselves.
Yeah, so I think there are several leads out there. I mean, there are a lot of people working on this problem. We think it needs a little bit more attention and really gearing toward treatment is really absolutely key, because there are millions and millions of people with long COVID and they need help yesterday. I mean, these people need help yesterday or the day before yesterday. And I think getting at a treatment that work, sooner than later is really absolutely the right approach.
And you mentioned earlier, I think we've both kind of touched on it, the sort of response to long COVID by, well, governments across the world, whether it's the US, the UK, Europe, or elsewhere. What kind of worries you the most there? And are there some countries that are doing better than others that we could learn from?
What primarily worries me is that governments are still not taking long COVID seriously enough. I think there is some movement around long COVID and recognition of the long COVID and funding and all of that. But I think it needs more attention, and we need to start taking it a little bit more seriously than we are taking it now, including here in the US and the UK and in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And that's really going to be very, very, very important to really help. This is really going to be very important or foundational in helping us solve these really complicated problems and arrive at a treatment. So what also worries me is that because we don't have a sort of a broad consensus about what is long COVID and how to really count it, and there's really not even an effort to count it in the US. I mean, the ONS, or the Office of National Statistics in the UK, they're doing sort of these surveys and coming out with these statistics, which is actually absolutely laudable and definitely better than no data at all. But I think there need to be a more concerted effort by governments to not only just provide us with lip service that's, oh yeah, we care about long COVID, but we want them to sort of devote more attention to it, count it, definitely put it sort of on a fast track to get treatment. I mean, they've done very well with vaccines, right? So you got vaccine on a fast track. So we really need almost like a Marshall Plan or a similar agenda, for long COVID, so we can get to treatment of long COVID as soon as we can.
Yeah. Because the numbers of people, I mean, I've certainly noticed in support groups, there are people that get better and leave, but there are people coming in faster than they're leaving, and the numbers are just going up and up and up. And with the infections being higher and higher every day, you just sort of think, this is getting insane.
Well, certainly, there are millions of people with long COVID in the US and millions more around the world. I mean, obviously, sort of it's everywhere. So it's really what really primarily worries me, that it needs more attention. People are focusing on governments and health systems, and they're generally focusing on the tip of the iceberg. And that's really, really, really small part of the COVID story. And beneath that tip of the iceberg, there's actually much bigger part that is called long COVID. And it actually, will last with us for generations. Some of long COVID manifestations, including, heart problems, heart failure, and diabetes, those things will scar people for a lifetime. Those things will stick with people for a lifetime. Those things are not gonna, just go away tomorrow. And they require the attention of governments and health systems throughout the world.
Yeah, it's a very short-sighted view, isn't it, to not really pay it enough attention. And you mentioned earlier again the sort of patient groups and advocacy and communities of patients with long COVID. And they've been hugely helpful at a very stressful time for lots of people. What are your thoughts on that? And is there more that people could be doing, or do we almost need to leave that to the researchers?
No, I think what the patient advocacy groups and what they've done is absolutely heroic. And had it not been for them, I don't think we would be talking about long COVID. I don't think I would be doing long COVID research. And I think what they've done is absolutely heroic. And I think they need to be commended on this. I mean, the way I see it, it's almost what sort of the HIV advocacy movement did, back then. So this is a 21st century version of the Larry Kramer of HIV, what people are doing now with long COVID and maintaining that sort of strong voice of advocacy. And arguably, had it not been for their strong voice and had it not been for them putting long COVID at the forefront, things would be very, very different. Things probably would not be talking about long COVID. Probably there would not be, a lot of interest in long COVID research by a lot of people. And we would be, years behind in trying to understand what it is. It would be buried. Like, look, previously, like the idea that the viruses produce a post-viral illness is not really new, but the people have not studied it, sufficiently enough. Like the idea that the virus can cause long-term ramifications or long-term sequelae isn't exactly novel or new. SARS-CoV-2 has a little bit of unique features, but the whole story of a virus causing problems in the long term, we've known that for at least like 100 years. So that's not novel, but I think people suppressed it, and people sort of like, okay, you're no longer coughing, like you don't have fever anymore, so that's it, you're done. Like your flu is cured, right? So, and we failed to pay attention and to systematically evaluate the post-viral condition. People had seasonal influenza, or people had like other viruses. And now with long COVID, especially with the attention that it's receiving from patient advocacy groups, I feel it's sort of changed the way people think about long COVID and give it more recognition. And I mean, arguably we still need more. I feel I'm on the side that we still need more attention and more resources and more people doing research on it and driving it toward really finding treatment that actually work for people and help people and alleviate that burden of long COVID and suffering that people are going through. That's really should be absolutely the goal. But the patient-led movement and patient-led research collaborative and the patient advocacy groups throughout the world, in the US, UK, everywhere else, are absolutely admirable. This is heroic. This is absolutely heroic. In my view, these people are the Larry Kramers of long COVID and the absolutely heroic performance, absolutely. And definitely my view changed things a lot. I mean, arguably it would have been absolutely totally different had it not been for patient advocacy movement.
Yeah, definitely. And my hope as well is that it will help people who've been suffering from longer than long COVID as well, people with ME, for example, or other post-viral things, that maybe this will make things better for them as well.
Well, that's the idea. That is like it's this silver lining here in the pandemic, and that's sort of we're already suffering from long COVID, so let's not waste this crisis. Let's learn from it so we can not only help people with long COVID, but also understand the post-viral condition better, so we can really offer people with ME, CFS, and other post-viral illnesses, treatment, or be able to understand their illnesses and their health condition better, so we can hopefully treat it also better. And I think we ignored that for a long, long time. People in the ME, CFS community, they will tell you that, we've been suffering for 20 years, or we've been suffering for 10 years, I've been suffering for 15 years, and the condition has been largely ignored. And here in the US, we say that they sort of like swept it under the carpet, as if like it doesn't exist. You're a small minority community that we want to study cancer because it's like more, I don't know. So people diverted their attention to other things and they ignored this chronic fatigue syndrome. And to our peril now, had we invested in understanding it 20 years ago, we would be better prepared now to really meet the challenge of long COVID. But we didn't. We missed all that opportunity. So hopefully we don't miss the boat again. Hopefully what we're going to do now is not miss the boat again, or not drop the ball again, and then try to seize the moment now and understand long COVID, not only to help people with long COVID, but also as a silver lining as well of this pandemic, to be able to once and for all try to understand the post-viral condition. And again, the idea that viruses lead to long-term consequences isn't really new. It looks to people like it's new because they haven't been paying attention for 100 years. Because if you ignore it, if you don't want to see something, if you don't want to see a phone or something, then it looks like I have nothing in my hand because you're ignoring to see it. But it's been there for 100 years. But, people chose to ignore it and chose to not do research on it and chose to sweep it under the rug. And as a result, now we're having to really literally discover the A and B and C of post-viral condition. We have to start from scratch, from the basics. Because even the A and B and C of the post-viral condition have not been well understood. So we really have to start from here.
Well, yeah, I really, really hope that it does happen now, at least.
Well, that's the hope, absolutely.
So what's next for you in terms of your work? Is it more long COVID or?
Well, absolutely. We feel committed. I mean, I sort of, for me, it's an obligation. It's a calling. So I feel like that, this is a major knowledge gap. And a lot of people are suffering from long COVID. And I feel that I need to do as much as I can and work as hard as I can to really help solve problems with long COVID. And again, like what the patient advocacy movement really helps me with is it gives me energy. Like when I see like all these people, talking and advocating, it's like, oh, well, these people, they have long COVID themselves. They're sick and tired and weak and fatigued. And yet they find, energy to vocalize and to do these things. And I need to find the energy to work on Saturday to get this paper out and work on Sunday to get that project done. And it sort of gives me energy to propel me forward. And I definitely feel that that's really what we're going to have to continue doing. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for all that you're doing for the long COVID communities. It's absolutely amazing. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I really thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. Again, thank you very much for the invitation. And I definitely feel there is definitely a place in my heart for the long COVID community. And I feel like you guys energize me and energize us and give us sort of a purpose and a calling, and enormously, enormously thankful for that.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch and